You are listening to Despair by Michael Brockbank. Episode 1. The wagon sat in the middle of the water-drenched field as the light rain continued to come down. Droplets exploded from the covers of the two lanterns resting on either side of the driver's bench with a slight echo of a metallic ping. Two men dressed in heavy robes and cloaks stood nearby, hoods securing their heads and providing shelter from nature's casual downpour. The younger of the two held out his hand wielding an aged and warped wooden wand. "Now, ignite the lanterns," the elder of the two said softly, pointing at the wagon. As the younger man spoke words of power to activate the wand, a massive eruption of fire formed at its tip and streaked forward, striking the wagon. The bolt of fire struck the vehicle with an explosive detonation that sent flaming bits of wood and metal in every direction. Both of the robed figures dove for the ground to avoid being struck by the debris. After a few moments, both men pulled their faces up from the puddles. The older gentleman's graying beard had soaked up a bit of mud and water. The younger lad was less fortunate, as his face was smeared with a mixture of mud and horse manure. His eyes widened as his pulse raced. For the first time while studying under as an apprentice, he felt true fear, not only for the safety of himself and his master, but for anyone who would have been standing next to the wagon when it exploded. "That's why you're not allowed to handle the wand. You have much to learn about control," the older man said softly, looking at his apprentice. The wagon itself had been reduced to a few bits of burning wood and a single wheel which had rolled several feet from where it once rested. Riley was one of the youngest pupils Galen had ever taken. From a very young age, the boy showed great promise for handling the mystic arts. Unfortunately, he was also headstrong and willful, only learning for the most prominent lessons through utter failure. However, Riley was also one to never make the same mistakes twice, and it was this character strength that gave Galen hope that his pupil would one day become a great sorcerer. The two stood up from their respective puddles as Riley handed the smoldering stick back to his master. Robes once soaked with water were now also smeared with grass and mud. "It's far more difficult than I imagined," the young man said, still shocked from the sheer amount of power that was sent forth. "You'll get there in time, lad," Galen said in a calm voice. The tone wasn't what Riley expected. Then again, Galen was never one to raise his voice in anger. "Come, let's get in out of the rain. We can clean this up once the sun returns." The old man slowly turned and started walking toward the nearby cabin. Riley stood for a moment considering what had just transpired. He blew a wagon to bits because he was arrogant enough to think he was capable of handling an ancient tool of power. He and his master could have been hurt, or worse. Looking back at the devastation in the middle of the field, he felt lucky the rain had continued. It would have been a chore to put out all the flames otherwise. "Come, Riley, wisdom comes from common sense," Galen called out as the rain began to grow with intensity. Looking back towards his master, a flicker of lightning parted the clouds above. Finally wiping the mud and horse manure from his face, the young man collected his thoughts and began to jog towards his master to catch up. The rain stayed on throughout the night, culminating into a storm that seemed destined to drown those who remained outside. Riley sat at his desk, studying from an ancient book by lantern light. It was written in a dialect long forgotten by the common world, but still used by those dedicated to understanding the true nature of the physical plane. Although he wasn't fluent in the text quite yet, Riley was capable of putting together the bits and pieces he could acknowledge. He was determined to understand why he couldn't control the wand's power. Galen had retired to his favorite chair next to the fireplace and began packing his wooden pipe. Pulling a small stone from his robe's pocket, he held it over the pipe's bowl. A small flame jumped from the stone and into the bowl's contents, igniting the material. Galen then drew in deep from the pipe and let out a billow of smoke along with a sigh of relief. Galen's pipe always smelled of fresh roses as the material burned, which was far better than what Riley had experienced at the local tavern. As the storm raged outside, Galen suddenly stopped, puffing on his pipe. He put it down on the table next to him and slowly turned his gaze towards the door. Looking up at his master, Riley put a finger on a line of text so he wouldn't lose his place in the ancient tome. Galen stood up from his chair at the moment a knock came from the door. The knock startled the young lad, making him lose the position on the page where his finger had rested. The frustration Riley felt was quickly replaced by the curiosity of who would visit at such a late hour during a storm. Galen moved to open the door, and there stood a tall, dark figure just outside the lantern's light. Riley found his silhouette to be quite menacing given the backdrop of the storm while being cloaked in shadow. "Good evening, sir," the figure said almost immediately. His voice was deep and reverberated throughout the cabin. "My name is Darius. I was traveling to Yarksboro when I was caught in the storm. I saw the light from your cabin and wanted to ask if I could share the warmth of your fireplace, if only for a few moments before moving on." Galen took a moment to respond, as if he was contemplating the question. "Yarksboro is several days' travel from your friend. This was a terrible time to plan a journey." Riley has never witnessed Galen turning anyone away from his home. He was the type of man who would offer assistance regardless of the cost. But this time things were different. The young lad could see the hesitation in Galen's face and mannerism. Something was very different about this situation, and it made the student uncomfortable to witness. Yes, come in and warm yourself by the fire. The tall man walked into the lantern light. His facial hair was several months in the making, and his face was swept with dirt, despite being out in the rain. He was a bulky man, lumbering into the cavern and having to stoop to clear the doorframe. His boots made a solid clump onto the wooden floor as he walked in. As he entered the cabin, Darius's eyes wandered about, almost as if he was looking for something in particular. Never once did his eyes meet with Riley's, seemingly to ignore the young man's presence altogether. Galen shut the door behind him and gave his student a look of apprehension. Darius quickly made his way to the fireplace and crouched down near the flames as his wet overcoat piled up near his feet. He put his hands up to warm them. I know you know why I'm here, so let's dispose of the false pretense. Where is it? Darius asked, looking back at Galen. His glaring blue eyes seemed capable of piercing into a man's soul like shards of ice. Galen slowly walked over to Riley's desk and looked the young lad in the eyes. It was like a completely different cloak of emotion dropped from the old man's face almost instantly. Instead of apprehension, the visage was that of a man with complete confidence. I've hidden many things from your ilk. Galen turned his gaze back towards Darius, and with a slight smirk crossing his lips, continued, You'll have to be more specific.